She was unaware her delivery driver husband was actually the owner of the company when she kicked him and his sickly grandmother out in the snow to marry a regional manager. What he did would shock her beyond comprehension. Victoria Matthews stood in the doorway of their modest apartment that December evening, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the eviction notice she'd typed herself, while her husband of 3 years, dressed in his worn delivery uniform with the company logo barely visible, carried his frail, oxygen-dependent grandmother through the bitter cold toward an uncertain future. The regional manager she'd been seeing in secret had promised her a life of luxury and status, but he had no idea that the man he'd been ordering around for months, the man whose wife he'd been seducing with expensive dinners and false promises, held every string of power in his hands. As snowflakes gathered on the shoulders of the grandmother's thin shawl, and the delivery driver loaded her portable oxygen tank into their decade-old sedan, Victoria smiled at her reflection in the window, completely oblivious to the empire she was about to lose access to forever. What would happen when the regional manager discovered the truth about who he'd been humiliating? How would Victoria react when the delivery driver revealed his true identity at the company's annual board meeting? Could the sickly grandmother survive the freezing night that her own granddaughter-in-law had forced upon her? And what shocking move would the husband make that would transform Victoria's carefully planned betrayal into her most devastating nightmare? The wind cut through the Chicago streets like frozen knives, but Victoria Matthews barely noticed as she watched the taillights of the battered Honda disappear into the swirling snow. Her soon-to-be ex-husband, James Richardson, had finally left, taking his burden of a grandmother with him, and Victoria felt nothing except relief mixed with anticipation for the new life waiting just around the corner. She closed the apartment door and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. The reflection in the hallway mirror showed a woman of 32, attractive by conventional standards, but with eyes that had grown harder over the past year. Those eyes had seen too many delivery uniforms, too many late nights when James came home smelling of cardboard and diesel fuel, too many conversations about building their future that never seemed to materialize into anything substantial. But that was about to change. Victoria's phone buzzed in her pocket. The text from Derek Morrison, regional manager of Quickship Logistics, made her smile. "Is it done? Can I come over now?" She typed back quickly. "Give me 20 minutes. Want everything perfect for you." What Victoria didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that Derek Morrison was about to have the worst night of his professional life, but not for any reason he could currently imagine. The regional manager position he held so proudly, the one that had allowed him to seduce a delivery driver's wife with promises of luxury and advancement, was about to become utterly meaningless in ways that would redefine his understanding of hierarchy and power. James Richardson had met Victoria at a corporate charity event, though she'd assumed he was there as a donor rather than as the anonymous benefactor who'd funded the entire evening. He'd been wearing a simple suit, expensive but understated, and when she'd asked what he did for a living, he'd simply said, "I work in logistics." It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The truth was that James Richardson, at age 28, had inherited Quickship Logistics from his father, who'd built it from a single delivery van into a regional powerhouse with 14 distribution centers and over 3,000 employees. But James had also inherited his father's philosophy: never let wealth separate you from understanding the business from the ground up. His father, Robert Richardson, had made James promise something on his deathbed. Spend at least 5 years working as a regular employee before you take the throne. Learn what makes this company actually run, not from reports or boardrooms, but from the loading docks and delivery routes. Promise me. James had promised, but he'd modified the plan slightly. He'd spent 2 years working his way through various positions in the company: warehouse associate, dispatcher, route supervisor, all while the board of directors and senior management knew his true identity. But then he'd met Victoria, and something had shifted in his approach. He'd fallen genuinely in love with her warmth, her ambition, her drive to create a better life. But he'd also noticed how her eyes lit up when she talked about success and status, how she measured people's worth by their job titles and bank accounts. James had made a decision that would prove either brilliantly insightful or catastrophically foolish. He would tell her he was a delivery driver, nothing more, and see if their love could survive without the weight of his wealth attached to it. "I want to be loved for who I am, not what I own," he'd confided to his grandmother Eleanor, the only family member he had left after his parents' deaths. Eleanor had raised her eyebrows from her armchair, oxygen tube trailing from her nose to the portable tank beside her. "That's noble, Jamie, but it's also dangerous. You're testing her, and tests like that rarely end well for anyone." But James had been determined, and Victoria had seemed genuinely in love with him, despite his modest delivery driver salary. They'd married in a small ceremony, moved into a reasonable apartment, and for the first year, everything had seemed perfect. The cracks had started showing in year 2. Victoria moved through the apartment quickly, removing the last traces of James and Eleanor from the living space. The oxygen tank stand went into the closet. The photographs came down from the walls. The modest furniture that James had brought from his grandmother's old house, pieces that were actually valuable antiques, though Victoria had never bothered to look closely enough to notice. She pushed into the spare bedroom. Within 30 minutes, the apartment looked like a different place, ready for the new chapter of her life with Derek Morrison, a man who understood success and wasn't afraid to pursue it. Derek arrived at 8:30 carrying champagne and wearing a smile that suggested he'd won some kind of victory. In his mind, he absolutely had. He'd identified an unhappy wife, cultivated her dissatisfaction with her delivery driver husband, and positioned himself as the superior alternative. It was a game he'd played before, though never with quite such satisfying results as watching one of his own drivers get kicked out into the snow. "You actually did it," Derek said, setting the champagne on the counter and pulling Victoria into an embrace. "I'm proud of you. That took courage." Victoria melted into his arms, breathing in his expensive cologne. "I couldn't do it anymore, Derek. The constant smell of diesel fuel, the way he'd come home exhausted every night, the way he wasted our money taking care of that sick old woman who isn't even really his responsibility. She's his grandmother. Let her children take care of her." Derek kissed her forehead. "You deserve so much better, and starting Monday, you're going to have it. I've already talked to HR about bringing you on as my executive assistant. $45,000 to start, full benefits, company car allowance. You'll be making almost as much as your ex-husband." What Derek didn't know, what he would discover in less than 72 hours, was that James Richardson's actual annual compensation, when you included his dividends, stock options, and profit sharing as the majority owner of Quickship Logistics, exceeded $7 million. But Derek was thinking only of base salaries, of the small-minded hierarchies he understood, completely unaware that he'd been playing a game where he didn't even know the actual rules. Derek Morrison had called James Richardson into his office for what he'd assumed would be a routine disciplinary meeting, but was actually an opportunity to humiliate the man whose wife he'd been seducing for the past 6 months. "Richardson, sit down," Derek had said, not looking up from his computer screen, a power play he'd learned from a management book. James had sat, still wearing his delivery uniform, his expression neutral. "What can I do for you, Mr. Morrison?" "Your delivery times have been slipping. Route 12 should be completed by 4:30, but you've been coming in after 5 consistently for the past 2 weeks. Derek had finally looked up, his expression stern. "That's unacceptable. We have standards here." James had nodded slowly. "My grandmother has had some medical appointments. I've been making up the time by skipping my lunch breaks, so the total hours are the same." I don't care about total hours, Richardson. I care about route completion times. If you can't handle the route as assigned, we'll need to find someone who can. Derek had leaned back in his chair, enjoying the power dynamic. Also, I'm going to need you to work this weekend. Double shift on Saturday, full shift on Sunday. We're short-handed. I can't this weekend, James had said quietly. My grandmother has a procedure scheduled, and I'm her only— Did I ask if you could, Richardson? Derek had interrupted. I'm telling you that you will. This is your job. If you want to keep it, you'll be here Saturday at 6 a.m. If you don't show up, don't bother coming back Monday. James had stood up slowly, and for just a moment, Derek had seen something in the other man's eyes. Not anger exactly, but a kind of assessment, as if James were looking at a specimen under a microscope and finding it wanting. I'll be here Saturday, James had said quietly, and then he'd left. Derek had smiled to himself. Victoria had already told him she was planning to end things with James that week, and Derek had wanted to make sure the delivery driver was thoroughly demoralized before the axe fell. It made the whole thing more satisfying somehow. What Derek hadn't known was that James had recorded the entire conversation on his phone, not for any immediate purpose, but simply because he'd learned over his years of undercover work that documentation was power. He'd also made a mental note that Derek Morrison's management style was exactly the kind of toxic behavior that had no place in quick-ship logistics culture, and that changes would be coming soon. But James had decided to wait. He'd wanted to see how this situation with Victoria would resolve itself naturally, without his intervention. He'd hoped, even then, that she might change her mind, that the woman he'd fallen in love with might remember what had brought them together in the first place. He'd been wrong. Eleanor Richardson sat in the passenger seat of James's old Honda, the oxygen tank secured in the back seat, watching the snow accumulate on the windshield as her grandson drove in silence. They were headed to a hotel, a nice one she suspected, though James would never say it outright, but her mind was elsewhere. She'd seen this coming for months, though she'd hoped she was wrong. Victoria had started looking at James differently sometime around the 18-month mark of their marriage. The looks of affection had been replaced with assessment, as if she were constantly calculating whether she'd made the right investment. The conversations had shifted from we to I, from shared dreams to individual disappointments. Eleanor had tried to talk to James about it several times, but he'd been stubbornly optimistic, insisting that every marriage went through rough patches, that Victoria was just stressed about her career, that things would get better once they got past this difficult season. But Eleanor, who'd been married for 47 years before her husband passed, knew the difference between a rough patch and a fundamental incompatibility. Victoria didn't love James. She loved the idea of success. And James, in his delivery uniform and modest lifestyle, didn't fit that vision. You should tell her the truth, Eleanor had said just last week during one of Victoria's increasingly rare visits to spend time with her husband's grandmother. Tell her what truth, Grandma? James had asked, though he knew exactly what she meant. About who you really are, about what you really own, about the fact that Derek Morrison works for you, not the other way around. James had shaken his head. If I tell her now, after 3 years, she'll never forgive me for the deception, and if she suddenly becomes loving again after finding out about the money, I'll know it was never real to begin with. Eleanor had patted his hand. Sometimes, Jamie, you're too much like your father, too principled for your own good, but I suppose that's better than the alternative. Now, sitting in the car as snow piled up on the hood, Eleanor wondered what would come next. James had always been brilliant at playing the long game. It was how he'd built QuickShip's market share by 17% during his undercover years, implementing ideas that the board kept approving without knowing their source. But this particular game had costs that went beyond business strategy. Where are we going? Eleanor asked quietly. James glanced at her, his expression softening. "The Parkview Hotel. I've rented us a suite for the month. After that, we'll figure something out." Eleanor knew that figuring something out probably meant moving into one of the 3 properties James owned in the Chicago area, but she didn't press. If her grandson wanted to maintain his cover a little longer, that was his choice. What she was curious about was what would happen on Monday, when the quarterly board meeting was scheduled. James had been planning something for weeks, she could tell. The way he'd been reviewing personnel files, the late-night calls with the board chairman, the amendments to company policy he'd been drafting, it all pointed to something significant. "You're going to reveal yourself on Monday, aren't you?" Eleanor asked. James was quiet for a long moment. "I've been anonymous long enough. It's time to actually run the company instead of just influencing it from the shadows. And there are some changes that need to be made, particularly in regional management." Eleanor smiled slightly. "Derek Morrison is about to have a very bad week." "Derek Morrison is about to have a very different career," James corrected, "but yes." Despite everything that had happened in his personal life, James Richardson showed up for his shift at 6 a.m. on Saturday, just as Derek Morrison had demanded. But he didn't come alone. Martin Chen, chairman of Quickship Logistics Board of Directors, accompanied him, along with 2 other board members and the company's chief operating officer. They weren't dressed for a distribution center, they wore business suits and carried tablets, but they moved through the facility with the confidence of people who belonged there. Derek Morrison arrived at 6:30, coffee in hand, and stopped dead when he saw the group of executives standing near the loading dock. His first thought was panic. Had he screwed something up? Were they here because of some complaint? His second thought was confusion. Why was Richardson there with them? "Mr. Morrison," Martin Chen said, extending his hand, "I'm glad you could join us. We're conducting some surprise inspections today at several facilities. This is the first stop." Derek shook hands, his mind racing. "Of course, Mr. Chen. Welcome. Is there anything specific you're looking for?" "We're evaluating management practices," the COO said smoothly. "Employee satisfaction, operational efficiency, adherence to company culture and values, standard quarterly review procedures." What Derek didn't know was that there were no standard quarterly review procedures that involved surprise Saturday inspections. This was entirely about him and about gathering documentation for what was coming on Monday. James, still in his delivery uniform, stood slightly behind the executives, watching Derek's face. For 3 years, he'd observed his regional manager from the bottom of the hierarchy, noting every shortcut, every corner cut, every instance of favoritism or intimidation. He'd documented it all meticulously, not out of any desire for revenge, but because he genuinely believed that good leadership mattered, and Derek Morrison was not a good leader. "Richardson," Derek said, noticing James for the first time. "You're late. I said 6 a.m. James checked his watch. "It's 6:32, Mr. Morrison. You arrived at 6:30. I've been here since 5:45, actually, helping unload the overnight shipment." Derek's jaw tightened. Having this particular employee contradict him in front of executives was exactly the kind of insubordination he would normally punish, but he couldn't do that with the board chairman standing right there. "We'll discuss your attitude later," Derek said tersely. Martin Chen raised an eyebrow. "Actually, Mr. Morrison, I'd like to discuss your management approach now. You have a few minutes to chat in your office." What followed was an hour-long interview that Derek would later describe as the most uncomfortable experience of his professional life. The board members asked pointed questions about his leadership philosophy, his approach to work-life balance for his employees, his thoughts on treating people with dignity and respect. Derek gave what he thought were good answers, the kind of corporate speak that usually satisfied executives, but he could tell from their expressions that something was off. They knew something he didn't, but Derek couldn't figure out what it was. When they finally left his office, Derek immediately called Victoria. "Something's going on," he said. "The board just showed up for a surprise inspection, and they were asking really weird questions. I think somebody might have filed a complaint about me." Victoria, still glowing from her first night in the apartment, without James and his grandmother, wasn't particularly concerned. "You're a great manager, Derek. I'm sure it's just routine. Don't worry about it." But Derek was worried, and his worry would prove entirely justified. Victoria Matthews stood in front of her closet, selecting the perfect outfit for her first day as Derek Morrison's executive assistant. She'd chosen a sophisticated navy suit that Derek had complimented when they'd gone shopping together the previous week, paired with modest heels and understated jewelry. She was finally going to be someone important, or at least adjacent to someone important. Executive assistant to a regional manager might not sound impressive to some people, but to Victoria it represented everything she'd wanted: access to corporate culture, proximity to decision makers, a career path that led upward instead of nowhere. James had never understood her ambitions. He'd been content to stay a delivery driver forever, apparently, living in their modest apartment, spending their money on his grandmother's medical expenses instead of on the life Victoria had dreamed of. Well, that chapter was over now. Her phone buzzed. Derek sending her the details for Monday morning. "Meet me at headquarters at 8:30 a.m. We're attending the quarterly board meeting as observers before we start your onboarding. Great networking opportunity for you." Victoria's heart raced. A board meeting on her first day? That was even better than she'd hoped. She'd get to see how the real power players operated, make connections, show them she was someone worth remembering. She texted back, "Perfect, can't wait." What Victoria didn't realize was that Derek's invitation was not optional, and it wasn't really about networking. The board had specifically requested that Derek Morrison attend Monday's meeting with any relevant guests, a phrase Derek had interpreted as an opportunity to show off his new executive assistant. But the board's actual meaning was quite different. They wanted Victoria Matthews there so she could witness what was about to happen to her new boyfriend and, by extension, to her carefully constructed plans for the future. James Richardson woke up at 5:30 in the Parkview Hotel suite, made coffee, and checked on his grandmother. Eleanor was already awake, reading on her tablet, the oxygen tube running to her nose, as it always did. "Big day," she said without looking up. "Yes," James agreed. "Are you nervous?" He considered the question. "No. Relieved, maybe. It'll be good to stop pretending." Eleanor set down her tablet and looked at her grandson. "You know this is going to devastate her, don't you? Victoria, I mean. Whatever feelings she has for Derek Morrison, finding out the truth this way is going to be brutal." James poured himself coffee and sat down in the chair across from his grandmother. "She made her choice, Grandma. I gave her 3 years to love me for who I am, not what I have. She chose differently." "And Derek Morrison? What happens to him?" "He gets reassigned," James said simply. "We're moving him to a position where his management style can't hurt people anymore. Probably some kind of project coordination role with no direct reports. He's not without skills. He's good at logistics planning, actually. He's just terrible at treating human beings like they matter." Eleanor nodded slowly. "And the company? This reveal is going to send shockwaves through the whole organization." "That's the point," James said. "For 3 years, I've been learning everything about how QuickShip actually operates from the ground level. I've seen what works and what doesn't, who the real leaders are and who's just coasting on their position. Now it's time to use that knowledge to make the company better." He checked his watch. "I need to go. The meeting starts at 9 and I want to be there early." "What are you going to wear?" Eleanor asked with a slight smile. James grinned. "My delivery uniform at first, just for the dramatic effect. But I've got a suit in the car for after the initial reveal." "Your father would be proud," Eleanor said softly. "Not of the drama. He hated drama. but of the work you've put in, the way you've actually learned the business. He'd be very proud." James kissed his grandmother's forehead. "Thanks, Grandma. I'll call you when it's over." The QuickShip Logistics boardroom occupied the entire top floor of the company's downtown Chicago headquarters, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of the city skyline. 23 people had gathered by 8:55 a.m. The 7 board members, the executive leadership team, several regional managers, including Derek Morrison, and a few observers and assistants. Victoria Matthews arrived with Derek at 8:45, her navy suit perfectly pressed, her confidence high. She noticed a few people giving her curious looks, probably wondering who Derek's new assistant was, but she ignored them, focusing instead on trying to memorize names and faces of the powerful people in the room. Derek was more nervous than Victoria had ever seen him. He kept checking his phone, adjusting his tie, scanning the room as if looking for threats. "This is weird," he muttered to Victoria. "Board meetings don't usually include regional managers unless something big is happening." "Maybe they're announcing a restructuring," Victoria whispered back. "Or a promotion. You've been doing great work. Maybe this is your moment." Derek wanted to believe that, but the presence of the board chairman, the COO, and several attorneys from the company's legal team suggested this wasn't about promotions. At exactly 9 a.m., Martin Chen called the meeting to order. "Thank you all for being here. We have some significant announcements to make this morning, and I wanted to ensure we had the appropriate witnesses present." He paused, scanning the room. "Many of you know that QuickShip Logistics has operated for the past 5 years under an unusual arrangement. Our founder, Robert Richardson, passed away 5 years ago, leaving the company to his son James with specific conditions. Those conditions required James to work in the company at ground level for a minimum of 5 years before assuming his role as owner and CEO. Derek felt Victoria's hand tighten on his arm. Something in her expression had changed, though she didn't yet understand why. Martin continued. "That 5-year period ended last month. James has spent the past 3 years working as a delivery driver, route supervisor, and in various other positions throughout the company, learning our operations from the ground up. Today, we're officially recognizing his ownership and announcing his appointment as Chief Executive Officer of QuickShip Logistics." The room buzzed with murmurs. Several people looked confused. One of the other regional managers leaned over to Derek and whispered, "Did you know about this?" Derek shook his head, his face pale. His mind was racing, trying to connect dots that didn't quite fit together yet. Martin Chen gestured toward the door. "James, would you like to join us?" The boardroom door opened and James Richardson walked in, still wearing his delivery uniform. Victoria's coffee cup slipped from her fingers, splashing across the table. Several people turned to look at her, but she barely noticed. Her entire world had just inverted itself in a way that defied comprehension. That was her husband, her ex-husband, the delivery driver she'd kicked out into the snow 3 days ago, walking into the boardroom, being introduced as the owner of QuickShip Logistics. Derek Morrison's reaction was slower, but no less devastating. The delivery driver he'd been humiliating for months, the man whose wife he'd seduced, the employee he'd threatened with termination just last week. That man was his boss, had always been his boss, would always be his boss. James stood at the head of the table, still in his uniform, and looked around the room with calm, measuring eyes. When his gaze landed on Victoria and Derek, sitting together in observers' chairs against the wall, he paused for just a moment. Victoria saw something in his expression, not anger exactly, but a deep sadness mixed with resignation. "Thank you, Martin," James said, his voice steady. "For those of you who don't know me or who know me only as a colleague in the field, let me introduce myself properly. I'm James Richardson, majority owner of QuickShip Logistics, and as of today, your CEO." He clicked a remote and a presentation appeared on the large screen behind him. Over the past 3 years, I've worked alongside many of you. I've loaded trucks at 3 a.m., driven routes in blizzards, helped customers track lost packages, and cleaned bathrooms at distribution centers. I've done this not as some kind of reality TV stunt, but because I genuinely wanted to understand how this company operates from every perspective. The presentation showed charts and graphs, operational efficiency improvements, employee satisfaction scores, customer retention rates. What I've learned, James continued, is that QuickShip is a good company with great employees and strong fundamentals, but we have some serious cultural issues that need to be addressed. He clicked to a new slide showing organizational charts. Specifically, we have managers who treat their positions as opportunities for power rather than service. We have leaders who measure their success by how many people they control rather than how many people they help develop. And we have systems that allow talented employees to be overlooked while politically savvy but ineffective managers advance. Derek Morrison felt every eye in the room land on him, even though James hadn't named anyone specifically. Starting today, we're implementing some changes, James said. First, we're restructuring regional management to emphasize servant leadership and employee development. Managers will be evaluated not just on operational metrics, but on employee satisfaction, retention, and growth. He clicked again, and Derek's name appeared on the screen under Management Reassignments. Derek Morrison, currently regional manager for the Central District, will be transitioning to a new role as Senior Logistics Coordinator for Special Projects. This is a lateral move in terms of compensation, but it removes direct reports and focuses on Derek's considerable strengths in planning and coordination rather than personnel management. The room was silent. Everyone understood what had just happened. Derek Morrison had been demoted in all but name, stripped of his power and authority in front of the entire company leadership. Victoria's face had gone completely white. She wasn't stupid. She could see the connections now, understand the full scope of what she'd done. She'd left the owner of the company for a regional manager who was about to be reassigned. She'd kicked out the man who could have given her everything she wanted, because he'd chosen to work honestly instead of leveraging his position. But the true weight of her mistake hadn't fully hit her yet. That would come later. James continued his presentation, detailing other organizational changes, new policies, and strategic initiatives. He was professional and thorough, showing none of the personal turmoil he must have been feeling. Only those who knew him well, like Martin Chen and Eleanor, would have noticed the slight tension in his jaw when his eyes occasionally drifted to where Victoria sat, frozen in shock. After about 40 minutes, James reached the end of his formal presentation. I want to thank everyone for their dedication to QuickShip Logistics. This company succeeds because of your hard work, not because of any one person's decisions. Going forward, I'm committed to ensuring that everyone who contributes to our success is recognized and rewarded appropriately. Martin Chen stood up. Thank you, James. I think I speak for the entire board when I say we're excited to see what you'll accomplish in your official capacity as CEO. You've already proven your commitment to this company in extraordinary ways. As people began to gather their materials and prepare to leave, James held up a hand. One more thing before we adjourn. I want to address something directly because I believe in transparency and I don't want rumors to spread. He looked directly at Derek and Victoria. Some of you may have noticed that Derek Morrison brought a guest to today's meeting, Victoria Matthews. What you may not know is that Victoria and I were married until 3 days ago when she ended our relationship to be with Derek. The room went completely silent. Several board members exchanged shocked glances. Derek looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. I'm not mentioning this to embarrass anyone, James continued, his voice even, but because I want to be clear about something. My decision to reassign Derek has nothing to do with my personal situation. Derek's management style has been problematic for over a year, and I've been documenting issues with his leadership since I started working in his region. The personnel changes announced today were planned before my personal life imploded, and they would be happening regardless of who Derek is or isn't dating. He paused, letting that sink in. However, I also want to be clear that Victoria Matthews will not be joining Quickship Logistics in any capacity. The offer of employment that Derek made to her is rescinded, as he did not have the authority to make hiring decisions for executive positions without board approval. Victoria, I apologize for any inconvenience this causes you, but I'm sure you understand that given our personal history, it would be inappropriate for you to work here. Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. James, We can discuss the divorce paperwork separately, James said, cutting her off gently but firmly. This isn't the appropriate venue. My attorney will be in touch. He turned back to the room. If there are no other questions, we're adjourned. Department heads, please stay for a brief follow-up meeting. Everyone else, thank you for your time. As people began filing out, Derek sat frozen in his chair. His career wasn't over. The new position James had assigned him was actually a pretty good role for someone who didn't want management responsibilities, but his pride was shattered. He'd been playing power games with the owner of the company, seducing the owner's wife, and he'd been too blind and arrogant to see the truth even when it was right in front of him. Victoria remained seated as well, though for different reasons. Her mind was replaying the past 3 years like a horror movie, seeing every moment through a new lens. Every time James had worked a double shift without complaint, he'd been choosing to understand his employees' lives rather than exploiting his power. Every time he'd brought home his modest paycheck, he'd been testing whether she could love him without wealth. Every time she'd complained about their financial situation, she'd been failing a test she didn't know she was taking, and now she'd failed definitively. Victoria caught up with James in the parking garage 40 minutes later after the department head meeting had concluded. He was walking to his car, not the old Honda he'd been driving, she noticed, but a sleek Tesla Model S that had probably been waiting in reserved parking this whole time. James, please, she called out. Please, we need to talk. He stopped, turned around, and waited for her to approach. His expression was neutral, neither angry nor welcoming. I didn't know, Victoria said, the words tumbling out. I swear to God, James, I didn't know who you were. I thought you were just a delivery driver who didn't care about success or ambition or building a future. I was building a future, James said quietly. I was building this company into something better. I was learning how to lead with wisdom instead of just authority. I was investing in employees and systems and culture. I was building something real, Victoria. You just couldn't see it because it didn't look like what you thought success should look like. Victoria felt tears streaming down her face. If you had just told me, if I had told you, you would have loved my money, not me, James interrupted, and I wanted to be loved for who I actually am, not what I can buy. That's not an unreasonable thing to want from a spouse. I did love you, Victoria insisted. In the beginning, I really did. Maybe, James acknowledged, but you stopped. And you stopped because I wasn't successful enough for you, or at least I didn't look successful enough. The man you kicked out 3 days ago was exactly the same man you married 3 years ago, Victoria. The only thing that changed was your patience with who you thought I was. Victoria wiped at her tears, mascara running down her face. What about Derek? Did you plan that? Did you somehow engineer him into my life just to test me? James actually laughed, though there was no humor in it. You give me too much credit for manipulation. Derek Morrison is exactly what he appears to be, a mediocre manager with an inflated ego and a pattern of inappropriate behavior with subordinates partners. You're not the first, Victoria. There were 2 complaints filed against him in the past year for similar conduct. I was going to reassign him regardless of whether you'd gotten involved with him." That revelation hit Victoria like a physical blow. "There were others?" "You're the first one who actually left her husband for him, as far as I know," James said. "But yes, Derek has a pattern. He identifies unhappy women married to men under his supervision, and he uses his position to seduce them. It's a power thing for him. The board and I have been building a case for months." Victoria felt sick. She'd thought Derek genuinely cared about her, that their connection was real, that he saw something special in her that James had missed. But she'd just been another conquest, another notch in Derek Morrison's belt, another example of his need to dominate. "I've made a terrible mistake," Victoria whispered. "Yes," James agreed, "but we all make mistakes. The question is what we learn from them." He unlocked his car. "My lawyer will send you divorce papers this week. The settlement will be generous. I'm not interested in punishing you financially. You'll get alimony for 3 years, enough to get yourself established. After that, you're on your own." "James, please," Victoria said desperately. "Can't we try again? Now that I know the truth, can't we?" "No," James said firmly, "because now I know the truth too. I know that you couldn't love me when you thought I was ordinary. I know that you valued status over character, appearance over substance. I know that when things got hard, you didn't communicate with me or work to fix our problems. You found someone else and kicked me out into the snow along with my dying grandmother." That last part landed with particular weight. Victoria had almost forgotten about Eleanor in the chaos of the morning's revelations. "How is Eleanor?" Victoria asked quietly. "Alive, despite your best efforts," James said, his voice harder than she'd ever heard it. "We spent Friday night in a hotel because you threw us out with nowhere to go. My 83-year-old grandmother, who needs oxygen to breathe, spent hours in a freezing car because you couldn't be bothered to show basic human decency. That, Victoria, is what I can't forgive. You didn't just betray me. You endangered someone vulnerable and defenseless because she was inconvenient to your plans." Victoria had no response to that. She'd thought of Eleanor as a burden, an obligation that James was foolish to maintain. She'd never considered her as a person, as someone's beloved grandmother, as a woman who'd raised James when his parents died and who deserved better than being thrown out into the snow. "I'm sorry," Victoria said, though she knew it was inadequate. "I believe you," James said, "but sorry doesn't change anything. Goodbye, Victoria." He got into his Tesla and drove away, leaving Victoria standing alone in the parking garage, the ruins of her carefully constructed plans scattered around her like debris. James Richardson sat in his new office, the CEO's suite that had remained empty for 5 years while he learned the business from the ground up, reviewing employee satisfaction surveys with his chief of operations. The changes he'd implemented were working. Employee retention was up 17%. Customer satisfaction had improved. Several toxic managers had been transitioned out of leadership roles, and a new culture of servant leadership was taking root. His grandmother Eleanor was doing better too. James had moved her into his penthouse apartment, hired a full-time nurse to help manage her medical needs, and spent his evenings with her when he wasn't traveling for work. She was still sick, still declining slowly, but she was comfortable and cared for and surrounded by love. "You did the right thing," Eleanor told him one evening as they sat together watching the sunset over Chicago. "With Victoria, with Derek, with all of it. I know it hurt, but you did the right thing." James nodded. "It did hurt. It still does sometimes. I really loved her, Grandma." "I know, sweetheart, but she didn't love the real you. She loved an idea of who she wanted you to be. That's not the same thing." "No," James agreed. "It's not." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Have you heard from her?" "Her lawyer contacts my lawyer about the divorce proceedings. It should be finalized next month. Beyond that, no. She moved out of the apartment, got a job at a different company, something in marketing, I think. Derek's in his new position and apparently doing fine. I hear he's dating someone from accounting now. Do you think he learned anything? Eleanor asked. James considered the question. I think he learned not to seduce the boss's wife. Whether he learned to treat people with actual respect, I'm not sure. But he doesn't have the power to hurt people the way he used to, and that's what matters. Eleanor patted his hand. Your father would be proud of you, not just for how you handled this situation, but for everything. You've become the leader he hoped you'd be. James smiled, though his eyes were sad. I wish he could see it. He can, Eleanor said with certainty. Wherever he is, he knows, and he's proud. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank lower, painting the Chicago skyline in shades of orange and gold. James thought about the past 3 years, about everything he'd learned and everything he'd lost. The experience had cost him his marriage and tested his faith in people, but it had also given him something valuable, certainty about who he was and what he stood for. He'd learned that true success wasn't about appearances or status symbols. It wasn't about having power over people or measuring worth by job titles. True success was about building something meaningful, treating people with dignity and staying true to your values, even when it was difficult. Victoria had taught him that lesson, though not in the way either of them had intended. His phone buzzed with an email from Martin Chen. Board meeting next week. We need to discuss the expansion into the Pacific Northwest. Your strategy proposal was excellent. Let's make it happen. James smiled and typed back a quick response. This was his life now, building the company his father had started, creating opportunities for thousands of employees, making decisions that actually mattered. It wasn't the life he'd imagined 3 years ago when he'd married Victoria, but it was a good life nonetheless. And somewhere across the city, in a modest apartment that was considerably smaller than the one she'd shared with James, Victoria Matthews looked at her own reflection in the mirror and wondered how she'd gotten everything so wrong. The divorce was almost final. Derek had lost interest in her within 6 weeks, moving on to his next conquest. Her new job was fine but unremarkable, with no real prospects for advancement. She thought about the Tesla she'd seen in the parking garage, about the penthouse apartment James had moved into, about the life she could have had if she'd just been patient, if she'd just valued the man instead of his perceived status. But mostly she thought about the moment when James had told her goodbye in that parking garage, his voice sad but firm, his decision final. She'd wanted to be someone important, someone successful, someone who mattered. Instead, she'd become someone who'd thrown away something real in pursuit of something shiny and false. The lesson had been expensive, but Victoria was finally learning it. Success isn't about how things look from the outside. It's about who you are when nobody's watching, about the choices you make when things are difficult, about whether you can love people for who they are rather than what they can give you. She'd failed that test spectacularly, but perhaps, in time, she'd get another chance to prove she'd learned something from the failure. Or perhaps not. Some mistakes once made can't be unmade. Some bridges once burned can't be rebuilt. Victoria closed her eyes and whispered to the empty apartment, "I'm sorry, James." But James Richardson was miles away, sitting with his grandmother as the sun set over Chicago, building a company and a life that didn't include her anymore. And that perhaps was exactly what both of them needed. The Chicago Business Journal's annual 40 Under 40 Gala filled the grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hilton, with the city's most successful young professionals, venture capitalists, tech entrepreneurs, and corporate leaders. James Richardson stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, champagne flute in hand, looking out at the city lights but not really seeing them. He'd been named to the list. Inevitable, really, given QuickShip Logistics' explosive growth under his public leadership. But the recognition felt hollow somehow. The company had expanded into 17 new markets. Employee satisfaction scores were at an all-time high, and revenue had increased by 43% in just 2 years. By every objective measure, he was succeeding beyond even his father's ambitious expectations. But success, he'd learned, didn't fill the empty spaces in your life. Mr. Richardson, a voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to find a young woman in an elegant black dress, her dark hair pulled back in a simple but sophisticated style. She looked vaguely familiar, though he couldn't immediately place her. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she continued, offering a hesitant smile. "I'm Rachel Okonkwo. I work in your Southeast Distribution Center. Well, I used to. I was just promoted to Assistant Operations Manager for the region." James's face brightened with genuine warmth. "Rachel, of course. You were the one who redesigned the package sorting workflow that saved us 20 minutes per shift. That was brilliant work. Congratulations on the promotion." Rachel's surprise was evident. "You remember that? I mean, you remember me?" "I remember everyone who makes QuickShip better," James said simply. "That's not corporate speak. I actually mean it. Your innovation is being rolled out across all our facilities now. You've probably saved the company millions in labor costs and reduced employee fatigue significantly. That matters." They talked for several minutes about Rachel's new role, her ideas for further improvements, her goals for the future. James found himself relaxing into the conversation in a way he rarely did at these networking events. Rachel was genuine, passionate about her work, unimpressed by titles and status. She reminded him in some ways of who he'd hoped Victoria might be. When their conversation eventually wound down, Rachel hesitated before speaking again. "Mr. Richardson, I heard about what happened with your wife. I mean, your ex-wife. I'm sorry. That must have been difficult." James was quiet for a moment. "You worked in Derek Morrison's region, didn't you?" Rachel nodded. "I did, and I saw how he operated. Several of us tried to report his behavior, but it never seemed to go anywhere until you dealt with it yourself." "I'm sorry you experienced that," James said sincerely. "The system should have protected you better. We've made changes since then. Anonymous reporting channels, third-party investigators, zero-tolerance policies. It shouldn't have taken the owner getting personally involved for someone like Derek to face consequences." "Those changes have made a real difference," Rachel said. "The new regional manager, Sarah Chen, is incredible. She actually listens to us, values our input, treats us like human beings instead of resources to be managed. The whole culture in our region has transformed." They were interrupted by the evening's master of ceremonies announcing that dinner would be served shortly, but Rachel touched James's arm gently before leaving. "Thank you for what you did. Not just with Derek Morrison, but with everything. A lot of us were ready to quit before you took over publicly. You saved more than just a company. You saved people's livelihoods and dignity." After she left, James stood alone again, thinking about that conversation. This was why the work mattered, why the painful lessons of the past 3 years had been worth learning. Real leadership wasn't about power or status or having people fear you. It was about creating environments where talented people like Rachel could thrive. "You're brooding again," a familiar voice said from behind him. James turned to find his grandmother Eleanor approaching slowly, supported by a sleek walker but looking stronger than she had in years. The new treatment protocol her doctors had started 6 months ago was working small miracles, giving her energy and independence she hadn't had in a long time. "I'm not brooding, Grandma," James protested. "I'm reflecting." Eleanor laughed, the sound raspy but genuine. "That's just brooding with better vocabulary. Come sit with me. These old bones can't stand for too long, even with the walker." They found a quiet table in the corner, away from the networking clusters. Eleanor studied her grandson's face with the knowing eyes of someone who'd watched him grow from infant to man. "You're thinking about her," Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. James didn't pretend to misunderstand. Sometimes. Not as much as I used to, but sometimes. Is that pathetic? It's human, Eleanor corrected gently. You loved her. Love doesn't just disappear because someone betrays you. It fades over time, transforms into something else, but it doesn't vanish instantly. I saw her last month, James admitted, at a coffee shop downtown. She didn't see me. I left before she could, but she looked different. Older somehow, though it's only been 2 years. Tired. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Did you want to talk to her?" James considered the question honestly. No, maybe a year ago I would have. I spent a lot of time imagining what I'd say if I ran into her, how I'd prove that I'd moved on and was doing great. But actually seeing her, I realized I didn't need to prove anything. Her opinion of me doesn't define my worth anymore. That's growth, Eleanor said approvingly. The divorce was finalized 14 months ago, James continued. I signed the papers, she got her settlement, and that was it. Sometimes I wonder if she ever thinks about what she gave up, if she has any regrets, or if she's found whatever it was she was looking for when she left me for Derek. Eleanor patted his hand. Does it matter? No, James admitted, it doesn't, but I'm still curious. What James didn't know, what he couldn't have known sitting in that ballroom surrounded by Chicago's elite, was that Victoria Matthews was, at that exact moment, sitting alone in her apartment reading that very same Chicago Business Journal article about the 40 under 40 honorees. Victoria's studio apartment in Lincoln Park was nice enough, certainly nicer than what many single women in Chicago could afford, but it was a fraction of the size of the penthouse she could have been living in if she'd made different choices. She'd furnished it carefully with pieces from Target and IKEA, creating a space that was functional but impersonal, as if she were still waiting for her real life to begin. The magazine lay open on her coffee table, James's professional headshot staring up at her. The article detailed his accomplishments. Youngest CEO of a major logistics company in the Midwest, innovative leadership practices that had become case studies at business schools, philanthropic work funding education programs for warehouse workers. There was no mention of his personal life, no indication whether he was dating anyone or had moved on. The article focused entirely on his professional achievements, but Victoria could read between the lines. This was who James had always been, someone who changed lives quietly, who built things that mattered, who measured success by impact rather than appearances. And she'd been too blind to see it. Her phone buzzed. Derek Morrison's name appeared on the screen, a text message asking if she wanted to grab drinks. Victoria deleted it without responding, just as she'd deleted his last dozen messages. Derek had circled back to her several times over the past 2 years, usually when whatever relationship he was currently in had ended, apparently thinking Victoria might be desperate enough to take him back. She wasn't. Derek had been reassigned again 6 months ago, not fired exactly, but moved to an even less influential position after his pattern of inappropriate behavior had continued in his new role. Last she'd heard, he was working in vendor management, a solitary position with no direct reports and no opportunity to leverage power over vulnerable people. Victoria felt nothing for Derek now except a vague disgust at her own judgment. What had she seen in him? The confidence, she supposed, the apparent success, the way he'd made her feel special, chosen, important. But it had all been hollow, a performance designed to feed his ego rather than build anything real. She looked again at James's picture in the magazine. In the photo, he was smiling, not the forced corporate smile she'd seen in so many executive headshots, but a genuine expression of warmth. The article mentioned that he'd been photographed at a quick-ship facility with employees, that he still spent at least 1 day a week working alongside warehouse staff and delivery drivers. Of course he did. That was who James was. Victoria's laptop sat open beside the magazine, Her LinkedIn profile displayed on the screen. She'd been updating it, preparing to apply for a new position at a marketing firm that promised better advancement opportunities. The work was fine, the pay was adequate, but she was still chasing something she couldn't quite name, still looking for validation through job titles and career progression. She was starting to suspect that what she was really looking for couldn't be found in any job description. Her phone rang, not Derek this time, but her sister Michelle calling from Portland. "Hey," Victoria answered, grateful for the distraction. "Hey yourself," Michelle said cheerfully. "I was just thinking about you. How are you doing?" "I'm okay," Victoria said automatically, then corrected herself. "Actually, I'm not sure. I'm looking at an article about James in the Business Journal, and I'm having feelings about it." Michelle was quiet for a moment. She'd been Victoria's chief supporter through the divorce, flying in from Portland to help her move into the studio apartment, listening to hours of tearful confessions about everything Victoria had thrown away. "What kind of feelings?" Michelle asked carefully. "Regret, mostly," Victoria admitted. "Not just about losing him, but about who I was when I made that choice. I keep thinking about how I valued all the wrong things, how I mistook Derek's arrogance for confidence and James's humility for weakness, how I literally kicked out a sick old woman into the snow because she was inconvenient to my plans." "You've grown a lot in 2 years," Michelle said gently. "That's what matters now. Not who you were then, but who you're becoming." Victoria wasn't sure she had grown, though. She was still chasing career advancement, still measuring her worth by external achievements, still looking for validation in all the same places that had led her astray before. "Do you think he ever thinks about me?" Victoria asked quietly. Michelle hesitated. "Does it matter?" "Everyone keeps asking me that," Victoria said with a bitter laugh. "But yes, it matters to me. I need to know if I completely destroyed something that could have been salvaged or if it was already broken beyond repair." "Vic," Michelle said carefully, "you kicked him and his dying grandmother out into the snow so you could be with his employee. Then it turned out he was actually the owner of the entire company, and you'd left him for someone who was about to be demoted. I don't think there's any salvaging that." Victoria knew her sister was right, but the truth still stung. "I know, I keep wondering what would have happened if I'd been patient, if I'd trusted him, if I'd valued character over status. You'd probably be living in a penthouse right now, married to a CEO and actually happy," Michelle said bluntly. "But you can't change the past, Vic. You can only decide who you want to be going forward." After they hung up, Victoria sat in silence for a long time, looking at James's picture in the magazine. She thought about writing him a letter, not asking for anything, just apologizing properly, telling him she understood now what she'd thrown away. But what would be the point? The divorce was final. He'd moved on. Any letter she sent would just be another attempt to make herself feel better, to ease her own guilt rather than actually contributing anything positive to his life. Some mistakes, Victoria was learning, couldn't be fixed with apologies. Some bridges, once burned, stayed burned. All you could do was learn from the ashes and try not to make the same mistakes again. She closed the magazine, shut her laptop, and went to bed, wondering if she'd ever stop measuring her life against the one she could have had. James returned home around 11, loosening his tie as he stepped into the penthouse apartment that still sometimes felt too large for one person. Eleanor was already asleep. The evening events exhausted her, though she refused to admit it, and the nurse had left a note saying everything had gone smoothly. He poured himself a whiskey and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the Chicago skyline. This view had cost him $7 million, but money, he'd learned, was just a tool. It could buy comfort and security and opportunities, but it couldn't buy the things that actually mattered. His phone buzzed with a text from Rachel Okonkwo. "Thank you for the conversation tonight. It reminded me why I love working for Quickship. You're building something special." James smiled and texted back, "We're building something special. It's not just me, it's people like you who make the difference." He thought about the evening, about the conversations he'd had with young professionals who were hungry to make an impact, about the recognition that meant something because it represented real achievements rather than just inherited wealth. His father had been right. The 5 years of working from the ground up had been essential. They'd taught him things no MBA program could have conveyed, given him credibility with employees that no title alone could provide. But the past 2 years of public leadership had taught him something else. Visibility came with its own challenges and loneliness. Everyone wanted something from the CEO. Access, opportunities, connections, favors. It was hard to know who genuinely cared about him as a person versus who saw him as a stepping stone to their own success. He thought about Victoria sometimes, not constantly anymore, but in quiet moments like this. He wondered if she'd found what she was looking for, if Derek Morrison had turned out to be the upgrade she'd imagined, if she ever regretted her choice. But mostly he wondered if he'd ever be able to trust someone again. The betrayal had cut deep, not just because Victoria had left him, but because of how thoroughly he'd been deceived. He'd given her 3 years to prove that love could exist without money, and she'd failed so spectacularly that it had shaken his faith in his own judgment. His phone buzzed again. Martin Chen, the board chairman. "Excellent showing tonight, James. The board is thrilled with your leadership. Your father would be incredibly proud." James appreciated the sentiment, but he wondered if it was entirely true. His father had been proud of building the company, yes, but he'd also been proud of his marriage, his family, his life outside of work. Robert Richardson had managed to balance success with genuine human connection in a way that James was still struggling to find. The penthouse felt very empty suddenly. Beautiful, expensive, perfectly decorated, and completely empty. James finished his whiskey and went to check on his grandmother one last time before bed. Eleanor was sleeping peacefully, the oxygen machine humming softly beside her bed. He adjusted her blanket gently and kissed her forehead. "At least I still have you, Grandma," he whispered. Eleanor's eyes fluttered open briefly. "You'll find someone else, Jamie," she murmured, half asleep. "Someone who sees you clearly, someone worthy of you." "Maybe," James said softly, "but I'm not in a hurry." "Good," Eleanor said, her eyes closing again. "Better to be alone than to be with the wrong person. Your father taught me that." James smiled, though she couldn't see it. "Sleep well, Grandma." He returned to his own room, changed into comfortable clothes, and lay in his king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a merger discussion with a West Coast competitor, a presentation to investors, a site visit to the new distribution center in Minneapolis. The work never stopped, and James was grateful for that. Work, at least, made sense. Put in the effort, make good decisions, treat people well, and you got results. Relationships were messier, more unpredictable, more vulnerable to the kind of catastrophic misjudgment he'd made with Victoria. But somewhere in the back of his mind, he could hear his father's voice. "The business is important, son, but don't let it be everything. The richest man in the cemetery is still dead. What matters is who you loved and who loved you back." James fell asleep thinking about that, about the difference between success and fulfillment, about whether he'd ever find someone who could see past the money and the title and the penthouse to the man underneath, someone who would have loved him just as much when he was wearing a delivery uniform and living in a modest apartment, someone, in other words, who was nothing like Victoria Matthews. The Quickship Logistics annual company picnic filled Grant Park with over 5,000 employees and their families, a tradition James had started in his first year as public CEO. He moved through the crowd easily, stopping to talk with warehouse workers, delivery drivers, office staff, and executives without any visible distinction in how he treated them. Rachel Okonkwo, now the regional operations director for the entire Midwest, walked beside him with her husband Marcus and their 2-year-old daughter. "This is incredible, James," she said, gesturing at the massive gathering. "I remember when these picnics were just departmental affairs with maybe 50 people. Now it's the whole company." "Culture matters," James said simply. "People work harder when they feel like they're part of something bigger than just a paycheck." They were interrupted by Eleanor, now 88, but surprisingly robust thanks to the experimental treatment that had exceeded everyone's expectations. She was accompanied by a woman James didn't immediately recognize, someone roughly his age with kind eyes and an easy smile, wearing jeans and a QuickShip volunteer t-shirt. "Jamie, I want you to meet someone," Eleanor said with barely contained excitement. "This is Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to Martin. She's the physician who developed the treatment protocol that saved my life. She's been volunteering at the medical tent today, and I've been telling her all about my wonderful grandson." James shot his grandmother a look that clearly said, "What are you doing?" but extended his hand politely. "Dr. Chen, it's a pleasure, and thank you, genuinely, for giving me more time with my grandmother. Your work has been miraculous." Sarah shook his hand with a firm, confident grip. "Please call me Sarah, and it's been my pleasure. Eleanor is one of my favorite patients. She actually follows the treatment protocol instead of arguing with me about it." They talked for several minutes about Eleanor's progress, about the research Sarah was conducting, about the challenges of making innovative treatments accessible to patients who couldn't afford experimental medicine. James found himself genuinely engaged in the conversation, impressed by Sarah's passion for her work and her complete lack of interest in his position or wealth. When Eleanor conveniently excused herself to check on the dessert table, leaving James and Sarah alone, he had to laugh. "My grandmother is not subtle," he said apologetically. Sarah smiled. "No, but she's delightful, and she clearly adores you." "The feeling is mutual," James said. "She's the only family I have left." They walked together through the park, conversation flowing easily. Sarah told him about her work at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, about her research into treatments for pulmonary diseases, about the challenges of balancing clinical practice with research demands. James found himself talking about QuickShip with genuine enthusiasm, explaining his philosophy of servant leadership and employee development. What struck him most was that Sarah never once asked about his wealth, his properties, his net worth, or his success. She was interested in his ideas, his values, his approach to leading people, the substance rather than the symbols. After about an hour, Sarah checked her watch. "I should get back to the medical tent. My volunteer shift isn't over for another hour, but this has been really nice, James. Your grandmother talks about you constantly, and I have to admit, I was skeptical. But you're actually as decent as she claims." James laughed. "That's probably the best compliment I've received in years. Would you be interested in having coffee sometime? Not as a patient's grandson and her doctor, but just as two people continuing this conversation?" Sarah's smile widened. "I'd like that. Though I should warn you, I'm terrible at dating. I work ridiculous hours. I'm passionate about my research to the point of obsession, and I have no interest in fancy restaurants or expensive gifts. I'd rather grab pizza and talk about things that matter." "That," James said softly, "sounds absolutely perfect." They exchanged numbers, and as Sarah walked back to the medical tent, James felt something he hadn't experienced in 7 years. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone trying to fix what was broken, but the quiet hope of someone ready to build something new. Eleanor appeared at his elbow, looking entirely too pleased with herself. "She's wonderful, isn't she?" "Grandma, you're shameless," James said, but he was smiling. "I'm dying. Well, technically I was dying, but the point stands. I'm old and I've earned the right to meddle in my grandson's love life. Eleanor squeezed his arm. She's nothing like Victoria, Jamie. She doesn't care about your money or your title. She barely even knew who you were until I told her. I noticed, James said. And yes, she's wonderful. We're having coffee next week. Eleanor beamed. Your father would approve. He always said the right person would be someone who challenged you intellectually, matched your values, and didn't give a damn about your bank account. They stood together watching the picnic, watching QuickShip employees enjoying time with their families, watching the community that James had worked so hard to build. It wasn't perfect, no company ever was, but it was good, and it was getting better. James's phone buzzed, an email from his attorney with the subject line, FYI, Victoria Matthews. He almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity got the better of him. The email was brief. James thought you should know that Victoria Matthews was arrested yesterday for embezzlement from her employer. Apparently, she'd been skimming from client accounts for about 18 months. She's looking at serious prison time. I'm sure the press will connect her to you eventually, so I wanted you to hear it from me first. Let me know if you want our PR team to prepare a statement. David. James read the email twice, feeling a complicated mix of emotions. Sadness, mostly, not for himself, but for Victoria, for the person she'd become in her endless pursuit of success and status. The woman he'd married, for all her flaws, would never have stolen from clients. But somewhere along the way, she'd lost herself completely. Eleanor noticed his expression change. What is it? He showed her the email. Eleanor read it slowly, her face grave. That poor, foolish girl, Eleanor said quietly. She had everything and threw it away, and then she couldn't stop chasing what she'd lost. This is tragic, Jamie. Yes, James agreed. It is. Are you going to make a statement? James thought about it, then shook his head. No, this isn't about me. This is about Victoria's choices and their consequences. I'm not going to use her tragedy to make myself look good by comparison. I'll hope she gets the help she needs in prison, that she learns something from this, that she eventually finds some kind of peace. Eleanor smiled sadly. You're a better person than she deserved. No, James said. I'm just someone who learned expensive lessons about forgiveness and moving forward. Holding on to anger about Victoria would only poison my own life. She's suffering enough without me adding to it. They stood in silence for a moment, and then James tucked his phone away and turned back to the picnic, to the thousands of employees who were his responsibility and his purpose, to the life he'd built from the ashes of his marriage. In the distance, Sarah Chen was treating a child's scraped knee, her competence and compassion evident even from across the park. James found himself smiling, thinking about their coffee date next week, about the possibility of connection with someone who valued the same things he did. The past had been painful, but it had taught him what he needed to know. Success without character was meaningless, status without substance was empty, and love built on anything except genuine mutual respect and understanding was doomed to fail. Victoria had taught him all of that, though not in the way either of them had intended. Now, finally, he was ready to use those lessons to build something real. Come on, Grandma, James said, offering Eleanor his arm. Let's go get some barbecue before the ribs run out, and then maybe you can tell me more about Dr. Chen, purely for medical history purposes, of course. Eleanor laughed, the sound raspy but joyful. Of course, purely medical history, and it just so happens I know her favorite flowers, her coffee order, and the fact that she's been single for 2 years because she hasn't met anyone who interests her intellectually. You're impossible, James said fondly. I'm helpful, Eleanor corrected. There's a difference. They walked together through Grant Park, through the community of employees who'd become like family, toward a future that was uncertain but finally, genuinely hopeful. And somewhere across the city, in a holding cell awaiting arraignment, Victoria Matthews sat with her head in her hands, finally understanding, too late, far too late, the difference between what she'd wanted and what she'd actually needed. Some lessons cost everything to learn, but for those willing to actually learn them, even the most expensive mistakes could eventually lead to wisdom. The question was whether Victoria would use her time in prison to find that wisdom, or whether she'd spend the rest of her life blaming everyone except herself for the choices that had led her there. Time, as always, would tell.